Stephen Miller's appearance on CNN left the network in stunned silence. A moment of unanticipated tension. The studio buzzed with the hum of cameras and lights, but the atmosphere felt different this time. The anchor, poised and confident as always, opened the conversation by discussing the administration's budget and the looming cuts affecting working-class families. Miller, however, wasn't here to simply defend policies. He had a different agenda. He wasted no time in shifting the conversation. "Do you know where $22 billion of taxpayer money went under Joe Biden's administration?" he asked, catching the anchor off guard. She hesitated, offering a vague response about the complexities of government funding. But Miller wasn't letting it go. That $22 billion could have provided housing for every homeless veteran in America, he said, his voice sharp, yet it vanished. The anchor quickly tried to steer the discussion back to the administration's priorities. But Miller was relentless. He called out the waste, pointing to small businesses crushed by inflation and healthcare costs that were skyrocketing. He asked why no one at CNN seemed to care about where that money had gone. As the conversation dragged on, the tension in the room intensified. The anchor, struggling to regain control, tried to focus on the administration's investments, but Miller countered, asserting that if those investments were truly for the people, they wouldn't be having this conversation. The interview ended abruptly, but not before Miller had successfully flipped the script, leaving CNN's anchor visibly shaken. It was clear that Stephen Miller was in control, and the network was left to grapple with the questions he had raised. As Stephen Miller sat across from the CNN anchor, the tension was palpable. "These aren't broad claims," he shot back. "These are real numbers," he continued, accusing the network of covering for the administration. "If CNN cared about accountability, you'd be investigating where taxpayer money is going," Miller pressed, his voice sharp. The anchor hesitated, but tried to steer the conversation back. "So, you don't support government programs for struggling communities?" she asked. Miller smirked. "I support accountability, not officials using taxpayer money like a slush fund." The anchor's frustration was evident as she tried to redirect. "Let's focus on the budget cuts," she said, "not the money being spent." Miller leaned forward. "The real impact is on the American taxpayer watching their money disappear." His words hung in the air. After a brief break, the energy in the room shifted. The anchor visibly rattled. "Tried again. The administration isn't throwing away taxpayer money," she said. "They're making strategic decisions." Miller wasn't convinced. "That's a great talking point, but after 2 breaks, you still haven't answered my question." He cut deeper, accusing CNN of cherry-picking narratives to suit their agenda while ignoring corruption. When asked why Republicans hadn't launched an investigation, Miller responded coldly, "They will, and I hope CNN covers it just as closely as they did the baseless accusations against conservatives." The interview ended with Miller still in control, leaving the anchor struggling to regain composure. The tension in the CNN studio was palpable as Stephen Miller sat across from the anchor, his calm demeanor contrasting with the rising intensity in the air. It was a typical political interview at first glance, but something about this one felt different. The lights were brighter, the cameras more intrusive, and the studio's polished desk seemed to gleam in the midst of the charged atmosphere. The anchor, a seasoned professional, adjusted her microphone and offered a practiced smile. "Stephen, welcome back to CNN," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "Always an interesting conversation when you're here." Miller nodded slightly, the faintest trace of a smile appearing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm sure it will be," he replied, his tone measured but with a glint of something more beneath the surface. The interview was about to take a turn, and Miller wasn't here to play by anyone's rules. The anchor didn't waste time. She dove straight into the topic at hand. "Tonight, we're discussing the administration's budget policies. Millions of Americans are struggling, and there's growing concern about the drastic spending cuts affecting working-class families. Can you justify these decisions?" Miller's eyes flickered for a brief moment, and then he leaned forward, his expression never changing. "I love how you frame that," he said, voice even but tinged with sarcasm. "But before we get into the spending cuts, let's talk about something else." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Do you know where $22 billion of taxpayer money went under Joe Biden's administration?" The anchor blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in direction. She quickly recovered, though, adopting her familiar journalistic poise. "Well," she began cautiously, "government budgets are complex, and funding is allocated to various agencies for different programs." Miller cut her off, his voice sharper now. "That $22 billion could have provided housing for every homeless veteran in America. Instead, it vanished, handed out, given away, and yet your network wants to talk about spending cuts." The studio went silent. The anchor's mind raced for a response, but there was something unnerving about the way Miller spoke, as though he already knew her every move. She had thought she was prepared, but now she found herself scrambling for words. A brief silence passed, long enough for the audience to sense the shift in momentum. Miller didn't break eye contact, and the air grew heavier. The anchor adjusted herself in her chair, forcing a smile. "Stephen," she said, attempting to regain control, "let's stay on track. The real concern here is how budget decisions affect everyday Americans. These cuts are hurting working-class families while prioritizing tax breaks for the wealthy. Can you address that?" Miller didn't budge. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "You want to talk about impact? Fine. Let's talk about the working-class families who watched $22 billion of their tax money disappear while their healthcare costs skyrocketed. Let's talk about small business owners being crushed under inflation while their money was funneled into a black hole of government waste." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And the best part, no one, not a single person at CNN, seems to be asking where that money went." There it was again, the shift. The anchor's expression flickered, and for just a moment, her confidence faltered. The studio, once full of carefully cultivated control, seemed to crack under the pressure. She inhaled sharply, gripping her pen a little too tightly, and began to speak. But Miller didn't let her finish. He said, his voice cold but measured, "You're not going to redirect this conversation. No one seems to care about where that money went. All you want to do is focus on these budget cuts. But you've ignored the real story." The anchor opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come as easily as they usually did. She knew she had to regain control, but it was clear that Miller wasn't going to let her. "Stephen," she said finally, her tone slightly more strained, "the administration has made significant investments into communities in need. These are necessary investments that will help lift people out of poverty and create jobs." Miller tilted his head, slightly, his smirk barely visible but unmistakable. "Necessary investments," he repeated, his voice almost playful. "Let's test that theory. You keep talking about working-class Americans, but do you know what $22 billion could have done for them? Because I do." He leaned in, his words deliberate. "That money could have been used to fully fund healthcare services for veterans. It could have revitalized small businesses crushed under Biden's inflation crisis. It could have secured our borders, reinforced law enforcement, and provided tax relief to struggling families. But instead, it disappeared." The anchor's lips pressed into a tight line, but she knew she had to keep the conversation moving. "Let's not turn this into an attack on the media, Stephen," she said, her voice now tinged with irritation. "That's exactly what this is about." Miller interjected quickly, "Because if CNN actually cared about accountability, you'd be running headline after headline about government fraud. You'd be investigating where taxpayer money is going. But instead, you're deflecting." The studio was silent. The tension hung heavy in the air, and the camera zoomed in slightly on the anchor's increasingly tight grip on her notepad. Miller was relentless, and the anchor's attempt to redirect the conversation was slipping through her fingers. "So, you're saying you don't support government programs aimed at helping struggling communities?" she asked, her voice thin with frustration. Miller didn't miss a beat. "I support accountability," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "What I don't support is government officials using taxpayer dollars like a personal slush fund while CNN provides them cover." The anchor's face tightened, but she forced a smile. "Stephen," she said, her tone colder now, "let's move forward. The issue isn't whether money is being spent. The issue is how these budget cuts are impacting everyday Americans." Miller's gaze never wavered. He leaned back slightly in his chair, but his words hit harder than before. "The only people impacted here," he said slowly, "are the American taxpayers, watching their hard-earned money disappear into thin air. But sure, let's move forward. Let's keep pretending this administration is looking out for them." The anchor's smile faltered for just a moment, and it was enough. The studio lights seemed brighter now, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. She exhaled, trying to regain composure. "I think we need to take another break," she said stiffly. The red recording light blinked, and the cameras powered down. Round 1 was over. Stephen Miller sat perfectly still, eyes unwavering, a smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. He knew that round 1 had been his. The anchor, visibly rattled, could only sit back and prepare for what was to come next. But Miller was just getting started. As the studio returned from its second commercial break, the energy had shifted. The anchor, once so composed, was now visibly more rigid, her grip on her notes tighter than before. The polished control she had at the start of the interview was slipping. Across from her, Stephen Miller remained unfazed, composed, calm, and completely in control of the moment. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the sharp contrast between them. The anchor's frustration was evident in the tightness of her posture, but Miller remained relaxed, his gaze steady, his confidence unshaken. "Welcome back," the anchor said, her voice steady but betraying the growing frustration beneath. "Before the break, you made some strong claims about government spending, Stephen. But let's be real here. The administration isn't just throwing away taxpayer money, they're making strategic decisions based on the needs of the American people." Miller smirked, his voice smooth. "That's a great talking point," he said, leaning back in his chair slightly. "But let's go back to reality. Because after 2 commercial breaks, you still haven't answered my question." The anchor let out a small sigh, clearly tired of the back and forth. "Stephen, we're discussing complex fiscal policies. You can't just cherry-pick a number and demand an immediate explanation." Miller's smirk didn't fade. "You mean like how your network cherry-picked scandals?" he shot back, voice dripping with sarcasm. "How CNN spent years obsessing over narratives that suited their agenda while ignoring real corruption. Because when $22 billion vanishes from taxpayer funds, that's not complex. That's theft." The anchor's jaw clenched, but she pressed on. "Stephen, if this were such a major scandal, why haven't Republicans launched a full-scale investigation into it?" Miller's eyes darkened slightly, and he leaned forward. "Oh, they will. And when they do, I hope CNN will be just as interested in covering it as they were in pushing baseless accusations against conservatives." The anchor forced a tight smile, her frustration palpable. "Stephen, let's pivot. I think the real question here is about priorities. You're accusing the administration of wasting taxpayer money. But are they really prioritizing the wrong things?" Miller's response was immediate and cutting. "I'm not accusing them. I'm stating a fact. The administration is prioritizing politically motivated payouts, not the needs of the American people." His words landed with precision, and the anchor had no response. As the conversation wore on, it became clear Stephen Miller had completely turned the tables. He had taken control of the interview, and the CNN anchor, despite her best efforts, was struggling to regain her footing. The tension in the studio was almost unbearable, and the weight of the questions Miller had raised lingered long after the cameras powered down. The interview ended, and Stephen Miller stood up, his smirk still intact. He had done exactly what he set out to do: expose the weaknesses in the narrative and leave the network speechless. Round 2 was his. Well,